The kiss lasted barely 3 seconds. 3 seconds that silenced the roar of the rain against the taxi roof, froze the bleeding man in the seat beside her, and turned a desperate medical gamble into something that couldn't be undone. Claire Thompson felt it immediately. The sudden shift in the air, the way the cramped, humid space of the cab tightened as if the city itself had leaned in to watch. Her lips had barely brushed his before she pulled back, her hands trembling as she checked his carotid pulse. She was ready to retreat, to go back to being just a nursing student trying to keep a drunk stranger from slipping into a coma. But the man didn't slump back. He didn't blink. He sat there, slumped yet impossibly lethal, his presence blocking the flickering glow of the street lamps outside the window. His shoulders were wide, filling the back seat. His suit was charcoal silk, ruined by the jagged tear at his ribs. It was the kind of expensive tailoring that didn't just show wealth. It hid scars. Claire's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had crossed a line she couldn't even see. "Are you with me?" she asked quickly, her voice lighter than the hammering of her heart. His eyes finally drifted to her face. Dark, cold, focused. They didn't soften with gratitude. They locked onto her like she was a variable he needed to calculate before he decided whether to let her live. "You touched me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Claire swallowed, suddenly aware of how small the taxi had become. She nodded, her gloved hands still hovering near his neck. "You were crashing. I needed to shock your system. It was tactical." The city around them kept moving. Tires hissed on wet asphalt. A siren wailed 3 blocks over. A black SUV mirrored their turn, its headlights filling the cabin with a hard, white glare. He placed one blood-stained hand on the leather seat between them, not touching her, but close enough that she felt trapped by the coiled power in his frame. The ink of a black snake moved across his knuckles as his grip tightened. "You shouldn't involve yourself in things you don't understand," he said calmly. She lifted her chin, the queen's grit surfacing through her fear. "I understand you're bleeding out on my lap." That earned her something new. Not a thank you interest. He studied her for another long second, then leaned his head back against the seat, giving her space as if he'd never been a threat at all. "Then keep driving," he said. That was all. Claire didn't wait for more. She turned to the driver, her pulse racing faster than it had any right to. In the shadows of the back seat, Choi Min-Seo watched her profile and he didn't look away. 10 minutes earlier, the night had felt manageable. The diner had been loud and warm, the kind of place where the only thing Claire had to worry about was an overcooked steak in her anatomy exam on Monday. The fluorescent lights of the Greasy Spoon diner hummed with a low-frequency buzz that usually signaled the end of Claire's sanity. It was 2:14 a.m., the hour when the coffee tasted like battery acid and the linoleum floors felt a mile long. Claire tucked her tips into her apron, her mind already drifting to the anatomy flashcards waiting in her backpack. "Don't forget the trash on your way out, Thompson," the manager barked from the back. Claire sighed, swinging the heavy black bag over her shoulder. She pushed through the heavy steel door, the humid New York night hitting her like a wet wool blanket. The alley was a canyon of damp brick and the smell of rain-soaked cardboard. She hauled the bag toward the dumpster, but stopped short when her sneakers splashed into a puddle that was too thick, too dark, and too red to be rainwater. At first she thought it was just another Friday night casualty, a drunk who hadn't quite made it to the subway. A man was slumped against a stack of wooden pallets, his head bowed, his legs sprawled across the oil-slicked pavement. "Hey," Claire said, keeping her distance. "Bar's closed, honey. You can't sleep here." The man didn't groan or mutter a slur. He just shifted, a slow, heavy movement that caused the light from the street lamp to catch the sheen of a charcoal gray suit. Claire frowned. This wasn't a local vagrant. The fabric was too fine, the shoes too polished. She stepped closer, the nurse in training taking over. "Sir? Can you hear me?" As she knelt, the metallic tang of blood hit her, sharp and undeniable. He wasn't drunk. He was leaking. Her eyes traveled up his torso, noting the way his hand was clamped tightly against his side, red blooming through the white of his dress shirt like an ink blot. She reached for his shoulder, but the moment her fingers grazed the expensive wool, his hand shot out. It was a blur of motion. Before she could gasp, his fingers were locked around her wrist with the crushing force of a vice. Claire's heart slammed against her ribs. Up close, the man was a terrifying study in contrast. His face was pale, sweat-beaded and strained, but his eyes, dark, obsidian sharp, were wide open and vibrating with a lethal clarity. On the back of his hand, a coiled black snake seemed to writhe as his grip tightened. "Get away," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "You're bleeding," Claire said, her voice shaking but steady. "If I walk away, you're dead in 20 minutes. Is that what you want?" For a long, agonizing second, they stayed locked in that grim tableau, the waitress in her stained uniform and the dying kingpin in the dirt. Slowly, the tension drained from his fingers. His hand dropped, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. His eyes fluttered shut, his head falling back against the bricks with a finality that terrified her. Claire didn't think. She grabbed her phone, but she didn't call 911. Something about the suit, the snake, and the silence told her that a siren would only finish what the wound had started. Instead, she stepped toward the mouth of the alley and whistled for a passing yellow cab, dragging the weight of a man she didn't know into a war she wasn't ready for. The taxi's suspension groaned as Claire hauled the stranger into the back seat, her muscles screaming under the weight of his dead-still frame. The driver, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too many New York nights, didn't even look back until the smell of copper filled the cab. "Hey lady, no drunks. I just cleaned these seats," he grumbled, his hand hovering over the meter. "He isn't drunk, he's in shock," Claire snapped, her voice cracking with a command she didn't know she possessed. She slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the narrow alley. "Drive. Just drive. I'll pay for the cleaning, I'll pay for the speed, just get us moving." The cab lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet asphalt before catching grip. Claire shoved her backpack under the man's head to stabilize his airway. In the flickering strobe of the city's neon, she finally saw him clearly. He was younger than she'd thought, his features sharp and aristocratic even under the mask of pain. Her eyes traveled down to his hand, which lay heavy and slack across his lap. The coiled snake tattoo she'd glimpsed in the alley was unmistakable now, a masterpiece of ink that looked ready to strike. It wasn't just a design, it felt like a warning label. She reached for the hem of his shirt, her nursing instincts fighting the tremor in her hands. As she peeled back the blood-soaked silk to assess the wound, a flash of white light flooded the cabin. Claire squinted, looking through the rain-streaked rear window. A black SUV had pulled out of the shadows 2 blocks back. It didn't have its high beams on, but the low, predatory glow of its LED headlights stayed perfectly centered in the glass. It wasn't passing. It wasn't slowing down. It moved through the light traffic with a terrifying, synchronized grace. "Sir," Claire whispered, her throat suddenly dry. "The car behind us. Do you know them?" The man didn't answer. His breathing was shallow, a ragged hitching sound that rattled in his chest. His phone, tucked into his pocket, began to vibrate. The hum was relentless, a rhythmic buzzing that felt like a ticking clock. Claire reached out, her fingers brushing the device, but the movement caused the taxi to swerve violently. "Lady, that guy behind us is riding my bumper," the driver yelled, his boredom replaced by genuine panic. Claire looked back again. The SUV was closing the gap, its massive grille looming like the jaw of a shark. They weren't just following, they were hunting. She looked down at the man, at the snake on his hand and the life leaking out of his side, and realized the drunk in the alley wasn't a victim. He was a target. "Don't stop," Claire told the driver, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Whatever you do, don't let them get alongside us." The taxi lurched as it took a corner on 2 wheels, the centrifugal force throwing the man's heavy body against Claire. His head hit her shoulder, and for a second, the intimacy of the contact felt surreal. A waitress and a dying kingpin huddled together in a sanctuary made of yellow tin and cracked leather. Claire pressed her palm against the wound in his side, trying to mimic the pressure of a real bandage. "Stay with me," she breathed, more for herself than him. Then the air in the cab changed. It didn't just shift, it froze. The man's body went from dead weight to coiled wire in a fraction of a second. Before Claire could cry out, her world flipped. A hand as cold as the rain outside clamped over her mouth, while his other arm, despite the jagged hole in his side, pinned her against the door. Choi Min-Seo was awake. His eyes were no longer clouded by the haze of the alley. They were obsidian, sharp and devoid of the vulnerability he'd shown moments ago. He didn't look like a man who had been rescued. He looked like a predator who had woken up in a cage he didn't recognize. The barrel of a small, sleek pistol he'd pulled from a shoulder holster pressed firmly into the soft skin beneath Claire's jaw. "Who sent you?" he rasped, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Claire's eyes went wide, her heart thundering against the hand he held over her mouth. She shook her head frantically, the smell of his expensive cologne and iron-scented blood filling her senses. "Answer me," he growled, the pressure of the gun increasing. Behind them, the black SUV roared, its engine a low-frequency snarl that rattled the taxi's frame. Min-Seo's gaze flickered to the rearview mirror, then to the driver and finally back to Claire. He took in her cheap waitress uniform, the name tag that said Claire pinned crookedly to her chest, and the hospital-grade gloves she'd pulled from her backpack. The murderous intensity in his eyes wavered, replaced by a dark, shimmering confusion. He looked at the blood on her hands, his blood, and then at the terrified grit in her expression. He realized then that she wasn't a professional. She wasn't an assassin sent to finish the job. She was an amateur. An innocent who had picked up a fallen crown and expected it not to burn her. "You're a fool," he whispered, his grip on her mouth loosening just enough for her to gasp for air. He didn't lower the gun, but the aim drifted slightly. "You should have left me in the dirt." "I'm a nursing student," Claire choked out, her voice trembling. "I don't leave people in the dirt." Min-Seo looked out the rear window at the pursuing headlights, then back at her, his expression hardening into something resembling pity. "Then you've just committed suicide, Claire. Because they don't leave witnesses." The taxi surged onto the FDR drive, the engine screaming in a desperate bid to outrun the inevitable. Rain lashed the windshield in rhythmic sheets, blurring the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of gray and neon. Inside the cab, the silence was more suffocating than the heat. Min-Seo had lowered the gun, but he hadn't put it away. It rested heavy on his thigh, a cold promise of the world Claire had accidentally entered. Min-Seo leaned his head back, his face a ghostly mask in the passing glow of the sodium lamps. He was losing blood again, the temporary clot Claire had managed to form failing under the stress of his sudden movement. Every time the driver braked, Min-Seo's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the door handle. He was a man accustomed to being the hunter, and the indignity of being prey was etched into every hard line of his body. Claire watched the rearview mirror. The black SUV was still there, a silent, unblinking shadow that refused to escalate yet refused to fall back. It sat exactly 3 car lengths behind them, mirroring every lane change with terrifying precision. It was psychological warfare. They were waiting for the taxi driver to tire, for a red light to trap them, or for Min-Seo to simply stop breathing. "They're not stopping," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the tires. Min-Seo didn't look at her. His focus was on the phone in his hand. The screen lit up again, casting a sharp blue light across his sharp features. It was a new notification, the vibration rattling against the leather seat like a dying heartbeat. Claire leaned in, her eyes catching the glow of the display. It was a message from a contact with no name, just a string of encrypted symbols. The preview text was short, stark, and chilling. "Don't trust." The rest of the message was cut off, leaving the warning hanging in the air like a guillotine. Min-Seo's thumb hovered over the glass, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Claire saw a flicker of something other than ironclad resolve in his eyes. It was a brief, jagged flash of isolation. In a world of silk suits and silver-tongued betrayals, the man who held the city in his palm had no one left to call. "Is that from your people?" she asked softly. He finally turned to her, his gaze heavy and dark. "I don't have people anymore, Claire. I have targets and I have enemies. At this moment, I can't tell which one you are." The phone buzzed again, a long, insistent vibration that felt like a scream. Min-Seo didn't answer it. He simply flipped the phone over, plunging the backseat back into a suffocating, rain-drenched darkness. Outside, the SUV began to pull into the left lane, its engine roaring as it prepared to draw level with the cab. The hunt was over, the strike was beginning. The SUV swerved, its front bumper clipping the taxi's fender with a scream of tearing metal. The cab driver shrieked, slamming his foot on the brake as they skidded across the rain-slicked bridge. "Hospital. I'm taking you to the ER," the driver yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "No." Min-Seo's voice was a whip crack even as he slumped lower. He grabbed the driver's headrest, his knuckles white. "No police. No records. If we stop at a hospital, we are both dead before the triage nurse finishes her notes. Claire looked at the SUV, which was already circling back like a shark sensing a kill. She knew he was right. In the underworld he inhabited, a hospital wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cornered space with only one exit. She looked at Min-Seo's face, now the color of gray ash, and the dark pool spreading across the taxi's floor mat. He didn't have 10 minutes, let alone the time it would take to bypass a security desk. "Get off at the next exit," Claire commanded the driver, her voice surprisingly cold. "3rd Avenue. Go." 10 minutes of bone-rattling turns later, the taxi screeched to a halt in front of a darkened storefront in a neighborhood that felt forgotten by the city. It wasn't her apartment, it was too far, but it was the only place she had a key for. The Mercy Street Clinic. It was a walk-in facility for the uninsured where Claire spent her weekend volunteer shifts. It was closed, it was empty, and it was stocked. She practically hauled Min-Seo out of the car, her shoulder soaking up his blood as he leaned his full weight into her. She fumbled with her keys, the metal teeth chattering against the lock until it finally clicked. She dragged him inside, the air smelling of lavender floor cleaner and old magazines. "Lock it," she gasped, kicking the door shut behind them. She steered him toward a curtained exam room, the wheels of a rolling stool rattling as they passed. She lowered him onto the crinkly paper of the exam table. Under the harsh, sterile glow of the overhead fluorescent lights, he looked even worse. The wound was a jagged, angry tear in his side, the edges weeping. "I need to cauterize or stitch," Claire muttered, her hands moving in a blur as she tore open a tray of sterile instruments. "I don't have enough lidocaine to make this easy for you." Min-Seo gripped the edges of the table, the black snake on his hand standing out in stark relief against his pale skin. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for the moment she would break. "Just do it," he rasped, his teeth bared in a grimace that was half challenge, half surrender. "If they find us, I need to be able to stand." Claire reached for the needle and the silk thread, her heart finally slowing into the steady rhythmic beat of a professional. She was no longer a waitress caught in a storm. She was the only thing standing between a kingpin and the grave. The sterile silence of the clinic was broken only by the rhythmic tear of medical tape and the distant, muffled sound of rain against the glass. Min-Seo lay back on the thin paper of the exam table, his chest heaving with shallow, labored breaths. The arrogance of the kingpin had been stripped away, layer by agonizing layer, leaving behind a man who was dangerously, hauntingly human. Claire worked with a clinical ferocity that surprised him. She had discarded her waitress apron, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender arms that didn't tremble as she swab-bled the wound with iodine. The sting must have been excruciating, but Min-Seo only hissed through his teeth, his eyes fixed on her face. He had spent his life surrounded by people who feared him or people who wanted to replace him. None of them had ever looked at him the way she did now, not as a legend or a threat, but as a puzzle of flesh and bone that needed fixing. As she leaned over him to begin the first stitch, a strand of her hair fell across her forehead. She didn't brush it away, she was too focused on the entry point of the needle. Min-Seo watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips moved in a silent count. She was operating on a man who had held a gun to her throat less than an hour ago, yet her touch was as steady as stone. "You aren't afraid," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "I'm terrified," Claire corrected him without looking up. She pulled the first suture tight and he flinched, his fingers denting the metal edge of the table. "But fear doesn't stop a hemorrhage. Pressure does. Skill does. So I'm putting my fear in a box until you're stable. You should try it." Min-Seo felt a strange, jarring sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with the needle. He watched the light catch the sweat on her neck, the sheer exhaustion behind her eyes that she was refusing to acknowledge. She was a waitress from Queens, a girl with a nursing exam and a life that made sense. By all rights she should have run the moment he drew blood. Instead she was here, her hands covered in his mess, fighting for his life with a quiet, stubborn dignity. He realized then that her savior complex wasn't a weakness, it was a force of nature. It made her braver than the men who guarded his fortresses in Seoul. As she wiped a bead of blood from his hip with a gentle, lingering motion, the air between them thickened with a different kind of tension. It wasn't the heat of the chase or the cold of the gun. It was the raw, uncomfortable intimacy of a man who had never been cared for, and a woman who couldn't help but care. The silence of the clinic was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the heavy, synchronized thud of boots on the pavement outside. Claire froze, her hand midair as she reached for a fresh roll of gauze. The shadows of 3 men stretched across the frosted glass of the clinic door, long, imposing silhouettes that radiated a military-grade precision. "They found us," Claire whispered, her blood turning to ice. She looked at the door, then at the small, useless scalpel on her tray. Min-Seo didn't panic. He struggled to sit up, his face contorting as the fresh stitches pulled at his skin, but his hand moved instinctively toward the holster at his side. He listened to the rhythm of the footsteps, his head tilted like a predator sensing its own kind. The lock didn't break, it turned. A master key clicked home and the door swung open. 3 men in charcoal suits stepped into the sterile light. They weren't the ragged, desperate thugs from the SUV. These men were polished, their expressions carved from granite, and as they entered they didn't raise weapons. They bowed. A deep, synchronized bend of the waist that felt jarringly formal in a low-budget clinic in Queens. "Chairman Choi," the man in the lead said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. "The perimeter is secure. The dissenters have been neutralized." Claire backed away until she hit the supply cabinet, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Chairman." The word felt heavy, laden with a history she didn't understand. She looked at Min-Seo, who had transitioned from a wounded patient back into a monarch in the span of a single breath. He didn't thank them. He merely nodded, accepting their presence as his birthright. "This is Park," Min-Seo said, his voice regaining its gravelly authority. He looked at Claire, and for the first time, there was a trace of something like apology in his dark eyes. "He is my head of security. And I am not a masterpiece of danger, for no reason, Claire." Park stepped forward, handing Min-Seo a tablet. The screen glowed with news feeds from Seoul, headlines in Korean with images of glass and steel skyscrapers, police cordons, and a logo featuring the same coiled snake tattooed on Min-Seo's hand. "You're the chairman of the Shinhwa Group," Claire said, the pieces of her scattered night finally clicking into a terrifying picture. She'd seen the name in her business ethics textbooks. A conglomerate that touched everything from shipping to tech, and, as the rumor suggested, the darker veins of the global underworld. "You're not just a businessman. You're the head of the 7 Stars Syndicate." "I am many things," Min-Seo said, leaning heavily on Park as he stood. He looked at her, his silhouette framed by his loyalists, the aura of power returning to him like a shroud. "But tonight, because of you, I am a man who is still alive." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw one last time. "The world you just saw? You can't unsee it, Claire. And my enemies won't forget the woman who stitched me back together." The air in the clinic had grown cold, stripped of the fleeting intimacy they had shared over needles and thread. Min-Seo stood now, supported by Park, his presence reclaimed by the shadow of the Shinhwa Group. He looked down at his ruined suit, then at Claire, who stood amidst the bloody gauze and discarded antiseptic like a survivor of a wreck. "You've done more than enough, Claire," Min-Seo said, his voice regaining its velvet-sheathed edge. "Park has a car waiting. There is a flight leaving Newark in 2 hours. You will be on it. I have a house in Jeju, private, secure. You'll stay there until the dust settles in New York. Consider it a paid leave from your studies." Claire shook her head, her hands still stained with the literal mark of his life. "I'm not going to Jeju. I have an exam on Monday. I have a shift at the diner. Can just go back." This was a one-night emergency. Min-Seo's expression didn't soften. It hardened into something resembling mourning. He didn't speak. Instead, he signaled to Park, who held up a smartphone. The screen displayed a grainy, high-resolution still from a street camera near the diner. It showed Claire dragging Min-Seo into the taxi. Then another image. A thermal scan of the clinic's exterior from 5 minutes ago. But it was the third image that stopped Claire's breath. It was a photo of her apartment building's front door, taken less than 60 seconds ago. A man in a dark windbreaker was standing in the foyer, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. "They don't see a nursing student, Claire," Min-Seo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "They see the woman who robbed them of their victory. To the men who tried to kill me tonight, you aren't an innocent bystander. You are a collaborator. You are the reason the throne is still occupied." He stepped toward her, the effort causing a flicker of pain to cross his face, but he didn't falter. He took her hands in his skin hot, hers ice cold. In the eyes of the underworld, you are mine now, he whispered. If you stay here, you die. Not because of what you know, but because of what you did for me. The only way you survive is if you stay under the shadow of the snake. Claire looked at the photo of her home, then at the man whose life she had saved. The savior complex that had driven her into the alley was now a golden handcuff. She wasn't just his medic anymore. She was his liability, his property, and his only surviving witness. I didn't sign up for this, she choked out. You signed it with a kiss in a taxi, Min-Seo replied, his grip tightening. Now we move. The black sedan moved through the city like a silent ghost, bypassing the grid of Queens for the soaring glass spires of Manhattan. When the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped into a world that felt like a fever dream. The penthouse didn't just overlook the city, it owned it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a shimmering, indifferent New York, while the interior was a temple of cold marble minimalist art, and a silence so profound it felt expensive. Claire looked down at her sneakers, still stained with dried blood and alleyway grime, and felt like a smudge on a masterpiece. The air smelled of sandalwood and ozone, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic sting of the clinic. This is home, she asked, her voice sounding small against the vaulted ceilings. This is a fortress, Min-Seo replied. He was eased into a white leather sofa by two of his men, his movements stiff but his eyes regaining their lethal shine. The transition from wounded man to kingpin was complete. Within seconds, the penthouse was crawling with life. A private chef appeared in the kitchen, his knife clicking against a cutting board with rhythmic precision. In the corner, a technician monitored a wall of silent security feeds, tracking the heat signatures of every living thing within a 3-block radius. It was opulence built on a foundation of paranoia. Claire wandered toward the window, but as she passed a side room, the door stood slightly ajar. She caught a glimpse of a man being held in a chair, one of the attackers from the SUV, his face battered, his hands zip-tied. Park stood over him, his expression as calm as a monk's while he held a pair of heavy pliers. The brutality was casual, a business transaction taking place just steps away from the velvet rugs and the fine wine. Claire recoiled, her stomach churning. She looked back at Min-Seo. He was sipping water, watching her with a detached, analytical gaze. You're horrified, he noted. It wasn't a question. I'm a healer, Min-Seo, she said, her voice trembling. I spent 8 hours today worrying about a patient's blood pressure. And you have people being dismantled in your guest room. The world is not a clinic, Claire, he said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. Up here the rules are different. Everything you see, the gold, the glass, the security, is the price I pay to keep the wolves at bay, including the ones currently at your front door. He gestured to a maid who approached Claire with a bundle of silk. Bathe. Change. You are no longer a waitress. In this house, you are the woman who saved the chairman. That makes you both the most protected and the most hated person in this city. Claire took the silk, its weight light as a feather but heavy as a chain. She looked out at the city, realizing that the invisible life she had wanted to escape was gone, replaced by a gilded cage where the view was beautiful, but the floor was stained with secrets. The penthouse felt different in the blue hour before dawn. The adrenaline of the chase had curdled into a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion, and the brutal interrogation in the side room had finally gone silent. Claire found Min-Seo on the balcony, wrapped in a black silk robe, staring at the horizon where the Atlantic met the sky. He looked less like a kingpin and more like a man composed of shadows. She sat on the edge of a stone lounger, a safe distance away. I used to watch the sunrise from the roof of my tenement in Queens, she said, her voice a soft thread in the wind. The air smelled like exhaust and burnt sugar from the bakery downstairs. I thought if I could just get my degree, if I could just move 10 blocks north, I'd finally be someone who didn't have to look over her shoulder. Min-Seo turned his head slightly, the moonlight catching the sharp bridge of his nose. And now you are miles above it and the view is worse. It's louder up here, Claire admitted. The silence is louder. Min-Seo let out a short dry laugh that turned into a wince as he clutched his side. I grew up in a house where the silence was a weapon. My father was the chairman before me. In Seoul they don't tell you that you have a choice. You are born into a rank and you spend your life killing anyone who tries to demote you. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things that didn't require guards to stand in front of them. He looked down at the snake tattoo on his hand, the ink dark and ancient. But when the coup started within the family, I realized that building wasn't an option. I had to become the wall. I had to become the predator, or I'd be the one buried under the foundation. We're both running from the same thing, Claire realized, her eyes meeting his. You're running from a throne you didn't ask for, and I'm running from a life that made me feel like I didn't exist. We both ended up in that alley because we were tired of being who the world told us to be. For the first time, Min-Seo didn't look at her with calculation. He looked at her with a recognition that was more intimate than the kiss in the taxi. He reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her hand, not to possess but to anchor. In Seoul they say that when you save a life you become responsible for it, he whispered. I think the reverse is true, Claire. You saved me, but now I am the only thing keeping your world from collapsing. We are two different stories written in the same ink. The sun began to bleed over the edge of the world, staining the glass of the penthouse a deep, bruised purple. In that quiet moment, the waitress from Queens and the boss from Seoul weren't enemies or allies. They were just two people realizing that the bridge between them was built of the very scars they were trying to hide. The peace of the dawn was shattered not by a sound, but by its sudden absence. The hum of the climate control died, and the floor-to-ceiling smart glass, previously opaque for privacy, flickered once and turned transparent, exposing them like specimens in a jar. The grid is down, Min-Seo said, his voice dropping into a lethal register. He tried to stand, but his face went white, a fresh bloom of red staining his silk robe. The stitches had held, but the internal trauma was an anchor he couldn't shake. A muffled explosion rocked the service entrance. Suddenly, the penthouse was a symphony of chaos. Shouted commands in Korean echoed through the halls, followed by the rhythmic, suppressed thwip-thwip of high-end submachine guns. Park's team was engaging, but the breaching team was fast, coordinated ghosts moving through the dark. We have to move, Claire said, grabbing Min-Seo's arm. Go to the panic room, he gasped, his hand fumbling for the pistol on the side table. It's behind the library. Code 0702. Not without you. The door to the master suite splintered. A flashbang detonated in the hallway, the white light searing Claire's retinas and the pressure wave knocking her to her knees. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw a shadow in the doorway, a tactical figure raising a weapon toward the bed where Min-Seo was slumped, vulnerable. Claire didn't have a gun. She didn't have the training to fight a professional assassin. But she had the clinic. She lunged for the heavy oxygen canister she'd insisted on keeping near his bed for his labored breathing. With a grunt of effort, she heaved the metal tank toward the doorway. As the assassin stepped forward, his focus locked on Min-Seo, Claire grabbed the heavy glass decanter of scotch from the nightstand and smashed it against the tank's regulator valve. The pressurized oxygen hissed out in a violent, invisible jet. In the same motion, she grabbed a decorative lighter from the table, flicked it and threw it into the mist. The resulting fireball wasn't an explosion, but a sudden roaring wall of heat that expanded instantly, throwing the assassin backward and filling the doorway with a curtain of flame. The man screamed, retreating as the fire consumed the oxygen-rich air. Now! Claire yelled. She didn't wait for him to agree. She ducked under Min-Seo's arm, using her savior complex as a literal engine, and hauled him toward the hidden seam in the mahogany shelving. She punched in the code, her fingers slick with sweat. The door hissed open and she rolled them both inside just as a hail of bullets chewed through the library's leather-bound books. The heavy steel door sealed shut, plunging them into a red-lit silence. Claire slumped against the wall, her lungs burning, her hands shaking so hard she had to tuck them under her arms. Min-Seo looked at her through the crimson gloom, his breathing ragged but his gaze filled with a terrifying new respect. An oxygen-rich fuel air burst, he managed, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodless lips. Remind me never to let you into my kitchen, Claire. The red emergency lights of the panic room hummed with a low rhythmic pulse, turning the space into the interior of a beating heart. Min-Seo sat on a steel bench, his fingers moving with practiced mechanical grace as he checked the magazine of a fresh handgun. He had stripped away the silk robe, replacing it with a tactical black shirt that hid the bandages Claire had so carefully applied. He looked like a king preparing for a crusade, but when he turned to Claire, the coldness in his eyes cracked. There is an extraction point through the service tunnel, he said, his voice flat and final. Park is waiting. He has a clean car, a new identity, and enough cash to make sure you never have to work a double shift again. You go to the tunnel. You don't look back. Claire stood in the center of the vault, her shadow stretched long against the steel. And where are you going? I'm going to end this, he said, the obsidian in his gaze hardening. The men outside aren't just looking for me, they're looking for the seat I occupy. If I leave now, they'll hunt us both to the ends of the earth. But if I take the head of the snake tonight, the body dies with it. You can't even walk without wincing, Claire countered, her voice rising with a mix of anger and fear. You're going out there to commit suicide. Min-Seo stepped toward her, the distance between them vanishing until she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He placed a hand on the wall behind her head, pinning her with his presence. This is the choice, Claire. I spent my life being the man they forced me to be. Tonight I choose to be the man who keeps you safe. If you stay, you're a target. If you leave, you're a memory. I'd rather have you as a memory and know you're breathing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He pressed it into her palm, a signet ring cold and etched with the same coiled snake that marked his skin. If I don't follow you within an hour, go to the address in the lining of the bag Park gives you. Show them this. They will protect you. Claire looked down at the ring, the weight of it feeling like an anchor. Her savior complex screamed at her to stay, to hold the bandage, to keep his heart beating. But she saw the resolve in the set of his jaw. He wasn't asking for her help anymore. He was demanding her survival as his final act of sovereignty. Min-Seo, she whispered, her fingers closing around the gold. Go, he commanded, his thumb brushing her cheek in a brief, devastating goodbye. Before I'm selfish enough to ask you to stay. He turned toward the heavy vault door, the light of the corridor flooding in as it hissed open. He didn't look back. He stepped into the war he had been born for, leaving Claire alone in the red-lit silence of the fortress. The penthouse was a graveyard of broken glass and spent shell casings. Min-Seo moved through the wreckage like a specter, his shadow lengthening against the marble floors as the emergency strobes painted the room in flashes of jagged white. He reached the grand lounge where the men who had orchestrated the coup stood waiting, their faces illuminated by the screens of the security monitors they had hijacked. In the center stood his uncle, a man whose hands had once guided Min-Seo's childhood and were now stained with the intent to end his legacy. He looked at Min-Seo's blood-streaked face and laughed, a dry, rattling sound. You look tired, nephew, the older man said, gesturing to the silent, armed guards circling the room. The reign of the Xinhua group doesn't belong to a man who hides in a queen's alleyway. It belongs to the strong. Min-Seo leaned against a structural pillar, his hand pressed to his side, feeling the steady thrum of the stitches Claire had placed there. They were a tether to a world that was softer, braver, and infinitely more valuable than this one. He pulled the phone from his pocket, the device Claire had pried from his hand in the taxi, the one she had risked her life to keep charged and close. Strength isn't just about who holds the gun, Min-Seo said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. It's about who holds the secrets. He tapped the screen. The "don't trust" message had been the tip of a digital iceberg. While Claire had been stitching his skin, the phone's encrypted background processes had been finalizing the transmission of a decade's worth of offshore ledger data, recorded bribes, and the true coordinates of his uncle's private accounts. The tablet in his uncle's hand chimed. Then the phones of every guard in the room began to vibrate in a discordant, frantic chorus. I didn't just survive tonight, Min-Seo said, stepping forward into the light. I waited until you were all in the same room to pull the trigger. Every asset you own has been frozen. Every loyalist you bought has just received a notification that their payment has been redirected to a dead man's switch. The color drained from his uncle's face as he scrolled through the data. The power in the room shifted instantly. The guards, realizing their payroll had evaporated and their secrets were now public record, lowered their weapons. They weren't soldiers. They were mercenaries, and their loyalty was as hollow as the air. Min-Seo didn't fire a single shot. He simply watched as the men who had sought to destroy him collapsed under the weight of their own greed. He stood in the center of the room, the undisputed chairman once more, but his eyes weren't on the city or the throne. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. 45 minutes had passed. Clear the room, Min-Seo commanded Park, who emerged from the shadows. And find me a car. I have a promise to keep at a service tunnel. The service tunnel was a concrete throat of damp air and flickering yellow light, smelling of old salt and the deep subterranean pulse of the city. Claire stood by the idling sedan, the signet ring biting into her palm, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel door. Every second that passed felt like a brick added to a wall between her old life and whatever was coming next. When the door finally groaned open, she didn't see the chairman of Shinhwa. She saw a man who was walking with a slight limp, his black shirt dusted with plaster, his face weary in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. Min-Seo stopped a few feet away. The power he had reclaimed followed him like a cape, but his eyes were only for her. He looked at the ring in her hand, then up at her face, searching for the fear he expected to find. "You're still here," he said, his voice a soft rasp that echoed against the damp walls. "I'm a bad listener," Claire replied, though her voice trembled. "And you still have my backpack." A small, genuine smile, the first she had truly seen, touched his lips. He stepped into her space. The danger that usually radiated from him softened into a strange, intense vulnerability. "The war is over, Claire. My uncle is in custody and the board has been cleared. I am no longer on the run. So I can go back?" she asked, the question hanging between them like a fragile glass wire. "To the diner? To the exams? To being invisible?" Min-Seo reached out, taking her hand and closing her fingers back over the ring. "You could. I've made sure your apartment is clean, your debts are gone, and your name is a ghost in the system. You could walk out of this tunnel and never see a snake again." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "But the city looks different from the top, doesn't it? And I find I don't want to look at it alone. I've spent my life following rules written by dead men. I'm tired of them." Claire looked at the man she had stitched back together in the dark. She thought of the anatomy exam and the greasy floors, then she thought of the fireball she'd created with a Scotch decanter and a dream of survival. The girl who had walked into that alley wasn't the woman standing in this tunnel. "I'm not a trophy, Min-Seo," she said, her queen's grit flashing one last time. "And I'm finishing my degree. I don't care how many fortresses you own." "Then we make our own rules," Min-Seo promised, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. "You finish your studies. I reshape the syndicate. And we see if a healer and a kingpin can find a middle ground that doesn't involve a high-speed chase." Claire let out a breath she'd been holding since the taxi. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the collar of his shirt, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of the end of one world and the staggering, terrifying beginning of another. The city hummed above them, indifferent and vast, but in the silence of the tunnel the new rule was set.